you.
Thank you. And good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Yes, the subject of this talk is pretty obvious there. We're talking about the Star of Bethlehem. So I'll be just recapping shortly the main points of the Gospel of St. Matthew, where the Star of Bethlehem is referred to, and talking about the Magi and the star that appeared in the east. Then I'll be asking the question, because my interest is in astronomy, are there any candidates, are there any astronomical things that happened at about the right time that could conceivably be interpreted as the Star of Bethlehem? Do they actually match up any particular astronomical happenings of the time? Do they match up with what we're going to look at in terms of the account of the Gospel of St. Matthew? And then we ask ourselves, well, do any of the dates match up? We don't know exactly when Christ was born, but the question is, do any of the things that we know were in the sky around that time, do they sort of match the timeline of the Nativity? And then I'll be using a bit of software which shows us what the sky actually looked like 2,000 years ago. It's relatively easy to calculate what was where. If we know where things are now and we know how they're moving in the solar system, we can work out what the sky would have looked like 2,000 years ago. And so we'll be using a little bit of software to replay, if you like, the events leading up to 1 BC. And then I'll just very quickly summarize. So let's remind ourselves what's in the Gospel of St. Matthew. The principal elements, and I'll be highlighting in red the 5 elements of the Gospel of St. Matthew that we're trying to match up to perhaps a real event. So the Magi, we're told, journeyed to Jerusalem because they were prompted by the appearance of a star in the east. So the first thing we have to try and explain is, what could that star in the east possibly have been? Bear in mind, it doesn't say they followed the star. They were prompted by a star in the east, and they went west. Okay, just bear that in mind. They went and talked to Herod and said, what's this we hear about the appearance of a new king, the birth of a king of the Jews? What's going on there? And Herod said, well, I'm not too sure what you're talking about. So we have to explain why an astronomical event might have been interpreted as there is a birth of the King of the Jews. And we also, ideally, would like to explain why King Herod said, don't know what you're talking about. The Magi then journeyed on to Bethlehem, and the star reappeared and then stopped in the sky. So it would be nice if we can find an astronomical candidate that matches each of those 5 elements. It appeared in the east. It would be interpreted as a birth of the King of the Jews. Herod might be unaware of what was going on. And is it possible that this astronomical event reappeared in the sky? And what do we mean by an object stopping in the sky? If we can find something that matches those 5 things in red, then maybe we've found a candidate for the Star of Bethlehem. Bear in mind that we're going by the Gospel of St. Matthew. We're not going by the Christmas Carol. And just to remind you about the lyrics in the Christmas Carol, that's enough of that. You can play it again later if you want to sing along. We 3 kings of Orient are. Where does the 3 come from? There's no mention of 3 people actually going to see the baby Jesus in the Bible. There is mention of 3 gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So if there's 3 gifts, it's often assumed that there were 3 kings or magi or wise men. That's just the assumption that everybody bought 1 gift, as opposed to 3 gifts mentioned, and actually 20 people showed up, but 17 of them didn't realize they were supposed to bring a gift. So it's just assumed that there were 3. So really, we shouldn't have 3 there. I'm a scientist. I like accuracy. I like precision. So if there's no mention of 3 people, we really shouldn't have 3 people in this Christmas carol. And where do you get kings from? There's no mention of kings in the Gospel of St. Matthew, or indeed anywhere. There's talk about magi, the wise men, but there's no mention of the number, and they are not referred to as kings. So we really ought not to have kings in the Christmas carol either. Where did they come from? The Bible doesn't say. They came from somewhere to the east of Jerusalem or Bethlehem. It might have been Persia, might have been India, might have been outer Mongolia, it might have been the Orient, but it doesn't actually say. So we really ought not to have that in there either. And remember, a star appeared in the east and then they went in the opposite direction. So to say that they followed a star, following yonder star, that's a bit of a stretch as well. So you can see this Christmas carol is rapidly falling to pieces. We really, if we want to be accurate, shouldn't be talking about we three kings of Orient are. If you want a scientist to get it right, then the Christmas carol ought to be closer to something like, not we three kings of Orient, but something like we, indeterminate number of men of unspecified geographic origin, saw a star. Now you can see why physicists don't write Christmas carols. It might be more accurate, but it doesn't meter quite as well as the original. And bear in mind, we should not talk about three kings. We should not talk about three magi or three wise men, because we're just assuming that there's three just because of the three gifts. So we really ought to talk about the n wise men, where n is a number bigger than one and less than infinity. We know it's plural because the Bible does mention magi, which is the plural of magus, and therefore there was more than one of them, and it does sound like it was the male gender, therefore it is multiple wise men, but not necessarily three. So we really ought to talk about the n wise men. Okay, another thing to bear in mind is when we're discussing the Star of Bethlehem, we mustn't get sidetracked into thinking the star means a star in the sense that we understand stars today. We know that planets, for instance, go around our sun and there's other stars in the sky, and maybe there are other planets going around those other stars. But in this context, when we go back hundreds, or in this case, thousands of years, star can mean something more generally. So it was known that there are a lot of points of light in the sky, and they were often called the fixed stars because although they do appear to move because of the rotation of the Earth, they stay fixed relative to each other, and we get the familiar constellations that we all know and love in the night sky. But in addition to all the fixed stars, some of those points of light were seen to move over the course of weeks or months or years across the sky. So these moving points of light were sometimes called wandering stars. Nothing to do with the Lee Marvin Paint Your Wagon. This is just wandering stars because they moved relative to the fixed stars in the background. We now know that these are planets going around the sun, but at the time they might have still been referred to as stars because they were simply points of light in the sky. So a wandering star is what we would now call a planet. And some of these points of light were not absolutely points of light. Some of them were just a little bit fuzzy, and some of them seemed to have tails. And these were called hairy stars or broom stars occasionally. And we now know what those are. We call them comets. They are icy bodies, and the ice evaporates as they get close to the sun, and they form tails. So hairy stars are what we now call comets. And we're still using the colloquial expression of shooting stars, meaning a meteor, a tiny particle of debris in the solar system. If it happens to come into our atmosphere, it glows very briefly for a fraction of a second, and we would call that either a meteor as part of a meteor shower, or we would call it perhaps a shooting star. So bear in mind, star can mean almost anything that you see in the night sky, other than the moon. I think everybody recognizes that moon is something different, but almost anything else you see in the night sky could be thought of as a star. So when we're looking at candidates for the Star of Bethlehem, we must bear that in mind. Do we get any clues from looking at any depictions of what happened? Now, of course, any painting of the Adoration of the Magi will have been painted centuries, many centuries after the event, but do we get any sort of a clue as to what was going on? Bear in mind, the Adoration of the Magi always shows three, usually three kings, for the sort of same reason the Christmas Carol does. It's just been misinterpreted. And there's usually in these paintings the Star of Bethlehem in the background, often depicted as a star, occasionally shining its light down onto the baby Jesus. So there's a few paintings we're going to have a look at. This is one by Botticelli. It's often assumed that this person on the right is Botticelli himself, a sort of self-portrait, or if you like, photobombing his own painting. Maybe that's the Star of Bethlehem right at the top. It's difficult to tell because it's right at the top of the image. It's the usual adoration of the Magi, except that Joseph is looking very bored in the background there, not taking any part in the celebration, it would appear. Perhaps that's appropriate because allegedly he took no part in the conception either, so perhaps this is appropriate. Other depictions, again, the Star of Bethlehem in the background. Giotto is one of the few artists who actually showed the nativity scene with what appears to be a comet in the background rather than a star. Most artists would interpret the Star of Bethlehem as being a point-like star. Giotto was a little different. He said, well, let's put a comet in the background. So that doesn't mean it was a comet, but it's interesting that back in, what was the date, 1305, people already appreciated that the Star of Bethlehem might not have been a star as such. Rubens, again, this is one of the few depictions of the adoration of the Magi in which the Star of Bethlehem apparently doesn't appear at all in the sky. Most of them have the baby Jesus, the adoration of the Magi, and the Star of Bethlehem in the background. This one apparently doesn't. It does have a two-headed camel in the background, which perhaps makes up for the lack of a Star of Bethlehem, but there we go. And there are various other artists, and again, quite often, a stellar-looking object, looks like a star, shining down onto the baby Jesus, perhaps. But of course, we can't expect to learn much from this because all of these paintings are just what you would expect to see for the Star of Bethlehem. They're not necessarily accurate depictions of what actually happened. It's just the imagination of the artist. But one thing we do have to bear in mind when we're thinking about interpreting, for instance, what's written in the account in the Gospel of St. Matthew, is the astrological significance of what was being seen in the sky. Hundreds of years ago, and definitely thousands of years ago, every object in the sky, every planet, every bright star, every zodiacal constellation had some astrological significance. So, for instance, I'll just pick out a few rather than give you an exhaustive list. The planet Venus, whenever it appeared in the evening or the morning sky, Venus was often associated with beauty and fertility and birth. And regardless of whether you're talking about Roman goddesses or Greek goddesses, this sort of idea tends to go across. So Venus would be called Aphrodite if you switch cultures, but we're talking about the appearance of the planet being associated with birth and fertility. Jupiter, a planet which can sometimes be almost as bright as Venus, Jupiter is often associated with royalty. It's considered to be the king of the planets. Again, Jupiter or Zeus, depending on which culture you're talking about. So Jupiter is considered the king of planets. We now know it's actually the largest of planets, so perhaps that's actually appropriate. It wasn't known at the time. Regulus is the brightest star in the constellation of Leo, and perhaps you can tell from its name starting REG, that particular star has been associated again with kings. It's sometimes known as the king of stars. It's part of the constellation of Leo, and the constellation of Leo the lion again is associated astrologically with certain things. Because the Leo constellation looks a little bit like a lion, regardless of whether you've seen one for real or whether you've just seen images of lions, then that particular constellation in the sky was associated with the Lion of Judea, because the land of Judea and the people of Judea had a flag on which there was a lion. And so whenever you see the lion in the sky, that gets associated geographically with a particular land, the land of the Jews. So why do people associate astrological significance to whatever they were seeing in the sky, whether it be the movement of planets or the appearance of certain constellations? Well, it was basically because it was believed that if you want to know what God is thinking and what God has in store for you, are we going to have a good crop? Are we going to have a famine? Is a flood on its way, etc.? All of these things will be mapped out in the sky. Astrologers can basically predict the future based on what they see in the sky. It's as if the sky is God's Facebook page, and that's where he posts what is coming up. God will arrange the sky, arrange the stars and the planets, etc., such that he will give messages to mankind. That's why astrologers took particular note of what was going on in the sky. So we can think about what candidates might exist. Knowing astronomically what happens now, and given that we can in principle turn the clock back and ask what was happening 2,000 years ago, we can ask ourselves what possible candidates might meet all of these criteria. These 5 headings here are the 5 things I highlighted in red from the Gospel of St. Matthew. The fact that the star must appear in the east, it must be significant enough to make the astrologers think, this is something to do with a birth of the King of the Jews. Herod apparently shouldn't be aware of this interpretation. The star has to reappear and the star has to stop in the sky. So we can ask ourselves, of all the possible astronomical candidates, which of them meet these criteria? For instance, could it be a meteor shower? Well, we have meteor showers all the time. Quite a few times every year, roughly speaking, once a month, we have a fairly strong meteor shower. Lots of particles of debris come into the Earth's atmosphere and we get shooting stars for usually a few nights, so they are particularly good. So, would shooting stars appear in the east? Well, when we do have a meteor shower, they appear pretty much all over the sky. So why would you possibly say this star appeared in the east? Why would you say a shooting star appeared in the east when the shooting stars are actually all over the place? So it's unlikely you would ever describe that as a star in the east. Is it significant? Well, meteor showers currently happen all the time, and as far as we know, 2,000 years ago, it's probable that they were happening every few weeks or every month back then. So why would the appearance of shooting stars be considered particularly significant? If it happens all the time, every year, multiple times every year, you wouldn't attach any particular significance to that. So yes, Herod might indeed be unaware of what people were talking about, because if meteor showers happen all the time, why should Herod attach any significance to that? No particular reason. Can meteors reappear in the sky? Well, if you get showers coming every few weeks or every month or two, then yes, you might see a meteor shower, and then a few months later you might see another meteor shower. So that's definitely possible. But what do we mean by stars stopping in the sky? Shooting stars, by their very nature, are flashing across the sky. So why would you ever describe a shooting star as stopping? That doesn't seem to fit. So we have some aspects that fit and others that don't. So it doesn't look like a shooting star fits the bill. What about the appearance of a comet in the sky? Well, a bright comet, well, it could appear in the east. Comets will appear in different parts of the sky, depending on how they're orbiting the sun. So yes, a comet might appear in the east. If it's bright enough, the appearance of a comet might be considered significant. If it was bright enough to be considered significant, well, why wouldn't Herod be aware of the fact that a comet had just appeared in the sky? Herod's eyesight wasn't actually particularly good, but he had a whole court of astrologers who were telling him, this is what's happening in the sky, this is what we consider to be relevant, or this is worth taking note of for the next few months or next few years. Can a comet reappear in the sky? Yes, it goes round the sun. Generally, they all go round the sun. And a comet might be visible in the morning and then go past the sun and then perhaps be visible in the evening, or vice versa, depending on how it's going around the sun. So yeah, a comet can appear, apparently disappear for a while as it goes around the sun, and then reappear again. So that can happen. Can a comet stop in the sky? Conceivably, yes, but unlikely. Depending on how the comet is moving, it might be, under the right circumstances, a comet might seem to be coming towards you, and hence, instead of going to the east or the west, it might seem to stop in the sky. But that seems rather unlikely, so I put an X on that one. So, doesn't look like a meteor, doesn't look like a comet. What about a nova, a new star? This is not a new star in the sense of a new star being born. This is a star that was originally barely visible that suddenly gets brighter. This happens, we understand how stars evolve, and some stars can change their brightness over a period of many years or over many decades. They can suddenly get brighter and then start to dim again. So a nova could indeed appear in the east. In principle, a nova could appear anywhere in the sky. Would it be significant? Well, if it was bright enough, it might be considered significant. But if it was bright, why wasn't Herod aware of it? Again, if the Magi saw it and thought it was significant, why didn't the astrologers in the court of King Herod think it was significant either? Can it reappear in the sky? Well, nova, when stars change their brightness and then fade away, they generally fade away for decades and then maybe get brighter again. They don't tend to go bright, dim over a period of months or a year or two. So that doesn't seem to fit the bill either. And why would you talk about a nova stopping in the sky? A nova is a star. It's part of the fixed stars. It's not moving through the sky. It's part of the fixed constellation patterns. So if the stars are fixed, why would you talk about a star stopping in the sky? So that doesn't seem to fit either. Same is true of supernova. Supernova is similar to a nova, except it's a much brighter object. When stars go supernova, they basically blow themselves to pieces, and you might get a very bright point of light in the sky, depending exactly where this supernova is. If it's close to us, it could be bright enough to be seen in daylight. If it's more distant, then perhaps not quite so bright. So again, it could appear in the east. It could be very significant if it's very bright supernova. But if it's significant enough to be, if it's bright enough to be significant, why wouldn't Herod be aware of it? And similarly, can it reappear in the sky? Well, supernova generally are stars that are at the end of their life and have blown themselves apart. Generally, stars don't blow themselves apart twice. Once they've done it, they're done, usually. So it's unlikely that it would reappear. And can it stop in the sky? For the same reason, if it's a star, part of a fixed constellation of stars, why would you say it has stopped in the sky? So perhaps you can tell that there is a fifth candidate, and I've effectively said I don't think it's any of these four, but maybe it is the fifth. And the fifth candidate for the Star of Bethlehem is a conjunction, a lining up of planets in the sky. I'll come back to a diagram of that in just a moment. But given that these wandering stars, these planets, are going backwards and forwards across the sky, every once in a while it is possible for two bright planets to get very close in the sky, and that might be considered significant. Could it occur in the east? Yes, it could. Would it have been significant depending on which planets were involved and where? Yes, that could be considered significant. Is it possible that Herod wasn't aware of it? Well, maybe his astrologers came to a different interpretation. They saw the same thing in the sky, but didn't necessarily interpret what they saw as this is a sign of a birth of the King of the Jews. Can it reappear? In other words, can a conjunction happen twice? Yes, planets are going around the sun, and two planets that happen to line up can move and line up a second time, so they can reappear in the sky. And I'll show you in a moment that it is possible for a planet to stop in the sky. So let's just make sure we understand the basics of orbital mechanics. If we've got a couple of planets going around the sun, doesn't really matter which ones they are, the principle of gravity is such that if you're closer to the sun, you move faster. So the inner planet, in this case, is going to move faster than the outer planet. It's not just a question that it's got a smaller racetrack to go around. It does move more slowly because of the pull of the sun. So some planets go around the sun quite quickly. Some planets go around the sun over much longer periods. Earth takes a year to go around the sun. Jupiter takes 10 years. Saturn takes 30 years, etc. But because the inner planet is actually going faster than the outer planet, something interesting can happen in the sky. If we imagine that the inner green planet is Earth and the outer planet is Mars or Jupiter or Saturn or any of the outer planets, remember the green planet is going faster. So although all the planets will appear in general to move from the west to the east across the sky, when the Earth is overtaking it on the inside lane, as it were, that planet can appear to be moving backwards. Just like if you've got cars going down the motorway and one car is going more quickly than another, as you overtake a car, the car you're overtaking appears to you to be moving backwards. Every vehicle, of course, is moving forwards, but if you're going faster than another car, that car will appear to go backwards. So that's what can happen. Although the planets will appear to move from west to east, every once in a while the Earth overtakes it on the inside lane and the planet appears to go backwards. So in the sky, the planet goes from west to east, but is then overtaken by the Earth and then appears to go backwards and then moves forward again. So this can happen, this sort of zigzag or S shape or little loop can happen for any planet whose orbit is outside the orbit of the Earth. We see this. Mars does a little loop. Jupiter does a little loop. They can go backwards. They can apparently go backwards just because the Earth is overtaking it. So if I just run that again, you can see in the sky, the planet appears to move and then stop in the sky, and then move backwards, and then stop in the sky, and then move forwards again. So planets can stop their motion as they go backwards and forwards in the sky. So let's have a think about the timeline. When was Christ born? We don't know. Here's a timeline of a few years BC. One thing to notice, there is no such thing as year 0. If you count backwards, AD 2 to AD 1, if you count backwards, you don't get to AD 0. There's no such year. You go straight from AD 1 to BC 1. So here's a few years before what is normally called the birth of Christ, but the Christ's birth, we don't know exactly which year that is. Many historians believe that Christ was born sometime in that period. You can see there's quite a big error. It's at least 2 years either way from possibly 6 BC. Part of that is based on the fact that we believe Christ was born during the reign of King Herod, and it is believed by many people that King Herod died in 4 BC. Therefore, Christ must have been born before 4 BC. But there are quite a few biblical scholars. I'm not one of them. I'm relying on other people doing their research here. Some people say, actually, maybe King Herod actually died in 2 BC, not 4 BC, or maybe even 1 BC. In other words, there is no document that says King Herod died in 4 BC. That would be a rather suspicious document if you did find that anyway. The records say King Herod died in the season in which there was a flood, followed by an eclipse, followed by this, followed by that, or whatever. You have to piece together other events to actually determine the actual year in which a particular person either came to power or died. And it is believed by some people that when it says that King Herod died this many months after an eclipse of the moon or whatever, they got the wrong eclipse, and there were multiple eclipses, and it wasn't this eclipse he died after, it was that eclipse he died after. So it is possible that King Herod died a little later, in which case Jesus might have been born a little later. I'm not too sure why people don't believe he's born between 3 and 4 BC, but it seems to be two camps. They either think he was born in this period or that period. The bottom line is we don't know, so we have to treat it as a rather fuzzy problem. But we do know about astronomical objects. We can't tell when he was born, but we know with fantastic precision what was in the sky because we know how the Earth moves, we know how the solar system moves, and we can calculate over 2,000 years. That's an easy problem. We can wind the clock back 2,000 years and say Jupiter was here, Saturn was there, Venus was here, a comet was there, etc. So let's have a look at some of the timeline. We know there were a few comets around at about this time. This comet in 12 BC was Comet Halley. We've seen that a few times in our lifetime. It comes around every 75 years or so. It's possible that Comet Halley was bright enough that it would have been a spectacular sight in the sky. But why would God post this on his Facebook page and put Halley's comet in the sky many, many, many years before the birth of Christ? So even though Halley's comet would have been a bright, spectacular object, it seems a bit early to be signposting this is the Star of Bethlehem because someone's going to be born in another 10 years' time or something. There are another couple of comets that are around. Astronomers will know Comet Holmes. Perhaps you don't, but Comet Holmes visited us a little while ago, and we believe that Comet Holmes would have been in the sky, but not very bright. So although the timing is right, Comet Holmes would not have been a spectacular sight. Similarly, this one, otherwise known as Comet 67P, this is the one that was visited by a spacecraft about 10 years ago. The Rosetta mission, we actually sent a probe and landed on this comet. Again, it's only a relatively small comet. Although it was around at the time, it would not have been very bright. So bright enough, but too early, about the right time, but too dim. So comets don't seem to fit the bill. What about nova, a sudden brightening of a star? Well, there is recorded evidence. According to the Chinese, there was a nova in 5 BC, and according to the Koreans, there was a nova in 4 BC. Nova, bright nova, are not that common. It's very unlikely that you wait for decades and decades and decades and then two come along at once. So it is thought that this is probably a misinterpretation of the dates in the Chinese calendar or the Korean calendar. In other words, they probably saw the same nova and a few months have got blurred so that the end of 5 BC or the early part of 4 BC, the same object was seen. But remember, although a nova might be in the sky and maybe it was bright, it doesn't seem to fit the bill for other reasons. It wouldn't reappear, it wouldn't stop in the sky. And then we come to the interesting one. Were there conjunctions of planets? So here, for brevity, I'm using astrological symbols. That little dumbbell symbol means a conjunction, a coming together in the sky of two planets. And these astrological symbols are here. Jupiter is this thing that looks like a curly 4. Saturn looks like a bit of an H, and Venus is this symbol circle with a cross underneath it. So there was a conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in about 6 BC. And it is thought by many people, perhaps that was the Star of Bethlehem, a conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. We had a similar conjunction of those two planets a few years back, around Christmas time. Bear in mind that as the planets go around the sky, they're not all in exactly the same orbital plane. In other words, the orbit in which Venus goes around the sun and Jupiter goes around the sun are slightly tilted relative to each other. So although they might come close in the sky, they don't cross each other. Usually they miss each other by maybe a degree or so. A degree isn't much, but that's twice the size of the full moon, if you want to think of it that way. So these points of light, as they move around the sky, will usually miss each other as they go through the same patch of sky. But I think it's very interesting to note that this conjunction here, not between Jupiter and Saturn, but between Jupiter and Venus. Jupiter and Venus are the two brightest planets in the sky. Saturn, generally speaking, being much further away, is not that bright. Jupiter can be very bright in the sky. It's very bright in the sky for the last few months or so. Saturn is not so spectacular, but Jupiter and Venus are both exceptionally bright planets. And this conjunction here, which occurred around about 2 BC, I think that's very interesting. Of course, it only works as the Star of Bethlehem if indeed King Herod died later than 4 BC. But given that we can't absolutely be sure, I think it's interesting to have a look. So although some people say it was this one, I think it's very interesting to take a closer look at that one, the conjunction between Jupiter and Venus. And we can use some software that allows us to dial the clock back and see what actually happened. So I appreciate you're not astronomers, so you don't know the sky that well, but what we're looking at here is the constellation of Leo. Perhaps you can see that. This sort of sickle is the mane of Leo, the mane of the lion. There's Regulus, the brightest star in the constellation of Leo. Jupiter is labeled, but I haven't labeled everything else. Otherwise, you get a screen full of labels and it gets very confusing. So I've labeled Jupiter, and I'm going to point out Venus, which at the moment is that star there. The zodiac, the chunk of sky through which, it's the racetrack, if you like, through which all the planets are moving. It's the plane of our solar system. The zodiac is a line that goes sort of like this. So planets will be moving backwards or forwards, generally from west to east, though occasionally Jupiter goes backwards. I've got this particular software set. At the moment, it's looking at August 1 BC. I know you can't read that up there, but I'm telling you that currently it's set to 1 BC. And we're looking at a chunk of sky, and I'm not going to show you what that sky looks like relative to the horizon, because if we move forward months and months and months, the horizon keeps changing and you'll end up getting seasick if everything is moving around all over the place. So I'm just fixing the gaze to a particular patch of sky located around the constellation of Leo. So if I run this forward a little bit from August 3 BC, what's going to happen? Jupiter is moving slowly towards the east. Venus, remember Venus is closer to the sun, it's moving faster. So as Jupiter moves, Venus is going to catch it up. So there's the video running. Venus and Jupiter are now very close in the sky. They are very close in the sky. They're not overlapping with each other. They might have missed each other by one full moon, if you think it. You could separate them with your thumb, perhaps. But still, a bright object coming close to another bright object would be considered quite interesting. And this conjunction of these two planets occurs in the constellation of Leo. And at this particular time of year, that conjunction would have been seen early in the morning before sunrise. This would have been a star in the east, a very bright star in the east, an unusual close approach. Venus associated with birth, Jupiter associated with kings, in the constellation of Leo associated with the land of Judea. Venus, Jupiter, Leo, birth, king, Jew. So maybe, astrologically, this would be interpreted as, that's a very interesting conjunction. It sounds like something interesting is happening about a birth of the king of the Jews. Astrologers might then say, it's worth keeping an eye on this patch of sky and see what happens next. So over the next few months, what happens? Well, Venus continues to move because Venus is moving a lot faster than Jupiter. Venus moves off. What happens to Jupiter? It moves past the bright star in the constellation of Leo. That's Regulus. The king of planets has just passed the king of stars, very close. And what happens as the Earth goes faster in its orbit? Jupiter appears to stop in the sky. The video is still running. Jupiter is now moving backwards in the sky because the Earth is overtaking it. Jupiter is now moving backwards, and the king of planets goes past the king of stars a second time because of this loop. And then Jupiter stops in the sky. The video is still running. Jupiter stops and then starts to move forward again. We're now in the spring of 2 BC. And what happens? The king of planets passes the king of stars again. So the king of planets has passed the king of stars, not once, not twice, but 3 times over a period of a few months. The astrologers might say something interesting is happening here. Kings seem to be dancing around each other. Maybe one king is going to give way to another king. Is it related to this birth of the king of the Jews that we were seeing in the earlier conjunction? So if there is going to be a new birth of the king of the Jews, maybe the existing king in the land of Judea, maybe Herod, ought to know about this because he's going to be usurped by another king about to be born. So they say, we keep an eye on what's going on there. We are getting signs that there's going to be a new king. Something very interesting is happening. Let's keep watching the sky. There's Venus that's come round again. And Venus is now going to be in conjunction with Jupiter again. So again, we have birth, king, still in the constellation of Leo, birth, king, Jews again. This time, the planets don't just come reasonably close. They come very close together. Venus and Jupiter are both very bright objects, but for this conjunction, they get so close together, no human could possibly split them as 2 objects. They effectively are so close together as appearing in the sky, they merge together into one even brighter object. That's something that I've never seen in my lifetime, and it's almost certainly something that the astrologers would never have seen in their lifetime before. It's a very unlikely event. Let me just show you how close Jupiter and Venus have got. This is, of course, before the invention of the telescope. Let's imagine we had a telescope, and let's zoom in to see what that actually looks like. How close do they get? They get so close, the disk of Jupiter and the disk of Venus, as seen from our perspective, would be so close together they would almost appear to be kissing each other. This scale here is just a tiny, tiny fraction of a degree. This is too close for a human to resolve. A human's vision in terms of how far apart would they have to be resolved as 2 tiny points of light, they would have to be separated by 10 meters or 20 meters. They are so close together, they would definitely merge as one object and appear really bright. If astrologers had never seen this before, then this almost certainly would be a birth king Jews, this is definitely it. Let's get on our camels, or whatever it is they ride, and get over to see King Herod to ask what's going on. So as a summary, this maybe is what the Magi saw. We can't be absolutely sure because we don't know which country the Magi were in, but regardless of where they were, Persia, India, Mongolia, they would have seen this very close approach of these two planets. So in 3 BC, there would have been a close, not a fantastically close, but a reasonably close conjunction of Jupiter and Venus, which could be interpreted as birth of the King of the Jews. As they kept watching for the next months, they would have seen the king of planets move past the king of stars, not once, not twice, but 3 times in succession. Maybe one king is passing a crown over to another king. Perhaps they then keep watching, and then in the summer of 2 BC, they see this spectacularly close conjunction where the 2 bright planets merge together as if one, and become even brighter than Venus ever gets, or even brighter than Jupiter ever gets. That could have been the starting pistol that told them, go and have a word with Herod, see what's going on. We don't know how long it would have taken them, even if that was the starting pistol, we don't know how long it would have taken them to get to Bethlehem, because we don't know where they started from. And we don't know whether they were walking or whether they had camels. Well, they had camels according to the Christmas cards, but no, there's no real indication that the Magi actually showed up on camels, so we don't know. It could have been weeks, it's more likely it was months between when they decided to leave their homeland to when they arrived in Bethlehem. One interesting point is, if they did arrive some months later, for instance, they might have arrived in December. If they did arrive in December, remember what Jupiter is doing, moving west to east, but every once in a while it stops in the sky. Well, as it happens, Jupiter does stop in the sky in December of that year. On which particular day does Jupiter stop in the sky in 2 BC? It actually stops in the sky on the 25th of December. That is a complete coincidence. There's no reason why it has to be the 25th. We know the 25th of December is not the birth of Christ. We know that that's just a pagan ceremony that the Christians took over. But it's interesting to note that, yes, Jupiter did stop in the sky some months after what might have been the starting pistol. That's right. So Jupiter stops and then goes backwards and then stops and then goes forward. It's the turning point on that S, as it were, or the loop. So these things happened. We know that these things happened. We can be confident within the timing of a minute or so, possibly even a few seconds. We know that these things happened. They would have been visible, and we know the timing is as indicated here. But we still have the question that although those conjunctions happened, we don't know whether or not that was the inspiration for the account. It is possible that these events took place. They were witnessed, and the story of this amazing conjunction was passed down through the ages, through the generations, and eventually the story of this amazing conjunction of planets ended up centuries later getting woven into the narrative of the Gospel of St. Matthew, which of course wasn't written at the time. It was written sometime later, beyond the Nativity. So it's possible that that conjunction was somehow woven into the story that ended up getting into the Gospel of St. Matthew. But maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was something else. Maybe it was a comet or a meteor shower or a nova or a supernova. We cannot be absolutely sure. It could be that it was a combination of events that ended up producing the inspiration for the Star of Bethlehem. Determining the astronomical events is easy because we can just say, where are the planets now, and wind the clock backwards. Second guessing the significance to which an astrologer will place on the events seen in the sky, that is pure guesswork. We know what happened. Trying to guess how people interpreted what they were seeing, that is basically just speculation. So we don't know whether that conjunction was the Star of Bethlehem. I just think it's fascinating to realize that a fantastic conjunction took place, and it would be probably hundreds of years, if not millennia, before a conjunction like that would happen again. I haven't checked all of the details, but I think a conjunction like that has happened once or twice in the last 2,000 years. Regardless of whether this was the conjunction, this was the thing that we now call the Star of Bethlehem, or whether it was something else in the sky, well, you could argue it doesn't really matter because the underlying message is still the same. And although it's barely mid-November, I'll still wish you a very Merry Christmas. Thank you very much.